My name is Sue Barber, and I am on the faculty at James Madison University. And today I want to share a few thoughts to help you as you prepare for the Virginia All-State Band and Orchestra Audition 2025. The piece this year is Weissenborn Advanced Study number 13, which is part of a great collection of etudes for the bassoon. And there are a lot of different recordings out there, and I would recommend listening to them. It really helps our learning to find good models, and it helps us to anticipate what's happening next. It also helps us to catch mistakes. We want to make sure that when we start a new piece and when we're working on a piece that we're always playing where we can perform perfectly. So it may be very slow to begin, but if we stay slow, we'll be able to gain that tempo later on if we're consistent in the slow context. I think the other thing we want to try to do is always play with our best tone and our best rhythm. So trying to catch all of that, and it may be that you do some work on the rhythm itself away from the bassoon. And I think figuring out how to simplify anything that might be challenging when you're working on the piece. So nothing is too crazy, change things around, take notes out, add things in, change articulations. And I'm going to talk about a few of those ideas today. The first thing I want to talk about is articulation. You have a lot of articulated passages here on the bassoon, and we want to try to make sure that our articulation and our slurring are match. And so I like to actually practice playing all three versions. So I would do a slurred version, a legato tongue, and an articulated staccato version, particularly of this opening gesture. What I'm listening for is that the sound doesn't change, that the sound of the notes don't change as I switch from one type of tonguing to the next. I'm also checking to make sure that my tongue is always touching the reed in the same place. And in the slurred context, it shows me anywhere my fingers might not be working very well. And so I would slur first, and you could do this with any passage that you're not happy with the way it's sounding. And work back and forth between all the different versions. Something that happens a lot on bassoon is cracking. And there are lots of different reasons why that can occur. Sometimes it's the reed, but a lot of times there are various things that we can do to help that. The first thing is just our basic air speed. If we get cracking in the upper register, when we play high notes like a high A, you get that kind of growling sound. That just means that the shape inside our mouth is a little bit too big, and or the air speed is not moving fast enough for that note. One way to find notes that you might not like the sound of, so you hear them or they sound out of tune, is to actually just try playing them without your tongue. So I just did a no tongue and then a tongue, and I'm trying to make sure my air is the same for each one. Another place where bassoon players tend to crack is in the low register. And again, that has to do with voicing. In this case, the space is too narrow. We have a low C on the second line of this etude, and getting to the low C, you have to lift off your whisper key. So if we're a little bit closed, then you might potentially crack that lower note. So the way I like to practice that is practice the interval from G to C. And I'm trying to make sure that my right hand is coordinated when I put all the keys down. And I'm going to keep my mouth kind of in that G position so I don't have to go as far to get down to C. And I'm going to use airspeed to help the notes that are in between. So and then I get an accurate note on the bottom. It doesn't crack and it speaks easily. And I don't have to move my jaw around a lot to get that to happen. Another place that we crack is our half hole, and that just takes a lot of practice trying to get that to be nice and clean as we're playing. You've got quite a few spots in this etude where you need to listen for that. So if I hear cracking, I might ask myself immediately, are these the notes that could potentially be cracking because of my half hole? And then I'll look at those very carefully. So you could take just a few notes in the very beginning, and I'm listening to make sure that it doesn't crack. Another thing that we might need to use here, and there are different schools of thought on flicking and venting. I tend to vent myself, so I actually hold the key open in my left thumb. Um, and to help certain intervals or to help notes be a little bit clearer. So examples of that might be in the beginning. So I vent the C, and then the B, and then the A. And I tend to just push the key down. So there are quite a few spots in this etude where that might be a strategy that you need to use to try to keep the sound nice and clear. Another thing you might need is an alternate fingering. When you slur up to an E natural or an E flat, either interval will work. We sometimes lift the first finger of the right hand on the E natural, and it helps that slur to come out a little bit cleaner. Some other fingerings that you might want to look at, there are different F sharps we can use. I tend to use what I would call my front F sharp or my pinky F sharp here, but in the key of A minor, which this etude is in, you can't, the F sharp, G sharp, unless you're sliding or moving or using a back G sharp, you may want to use your thumb. So trying to figure out exactly which fingerings you're going to use in which place. There are a lot of fingerings for the higher F sharp, and you might find that a different one works better in the passage. Sometimes it's just finding a fingering that makes the passage feel smoother. Another fingering choice you might need to make is D flat above the staff. There are two fingerings for that note. One's a little higher and brighter, and one's a little darker and lower. So some people use only one or the other. I tend to mix and match and use them in different situations. And so that would be another fingering that you might want to consider. A good place to look for basic fingerings if you don't have a good fingering chart on hand is to look for Let's Play Bassoon, which is a resource that was put together a long time ago by the Fox Corporation, and I believe on their website they have a PDF which is available to you. It talks a little bit about reeds, basics of bassoon. It's a very nice visual fingering chart, although it doesn't by any means include all the options, but if you have a question, it might give you some answers there. And it's really easy to read, so it's a quick reference if you need one. One other thing about fingerings in this particular etude, we have a lot of what we would call cross fingerings, which means that you're going a forked fingering or 1 and 3, and then you have to go to a pattern like this. These little turns, all of those little turns, the one up to on the G to A, they all have involve moving cross patterns, what we would call. You don't just lift a finger to get to the next note. And what I try to think about doing, and it's hard to see in this video, but I'll hold my bassoon up, is I try to lead with the finger going down. So for example, from E to D sharp and back to E very quickly. I'm focusing when I go down on the middle finger, and then when I come back, I'm focusing on these two. So if I lead with those fingers, it helps me to coordinate that a little bit more. For the upper A, G, F sharp, you're doing the same thing in this hand where you're going back and forth here. So from the A, I lead with these two fingers, and from the G, I'm going to lead with my third finger. So that may be something to practice and consider. Some other things we might want to think about are some different practice strategies. You can always use practice rhythms, practicing in little chunks. Those are all great things to do, using your metronome to keep you steady. And really importantly, make sure that you're not chasing the metronome. So if your metronome is set a little bit too fast, your fingers are going to be tense, and it's going to make it harder to be smooth and even in what you're doing. And it'll make it harder to get faster. So you want to try to monitor that, keep your hands nice and relaxed. One of the things that other things that I like to do, things like shifting the pulse. So we have this pattern on the third line. So on that particular pattern, I actually like to practice it shifting the pulse. And one of the things that does for me, if it's hard for me to get my mind around that, then when I can do that effectively, then I could go back to my original pattern. It also, the slur begins on each one of those, even though it's on the end of the pulse. That's the start of a slur, and it's a little bit easier to get my focus. It gets me used to hearing what that pattern is. One of the things I like to do as I practice is to actually leave notes out. So we have a lot of these patterns. And you might want to practice just the lower notes. Something like that. You could also practice the upper notes. We could also practice taking out some of the notes. This is on the third line. That helps me to think about what's coming next. I can move my fingers in the rest that I've created, and then when I put it all back together, it feels a little bit better. You could do twos. Or and do various combinations of that. I find that helps me out a lot as well as I'm practicing. Another exercise I could do is what I call the step down tempo method of gaining speed. So if I can play an entire passage at that particular tempo, then what I can actually do, and I can do it consistently, this is a little bit under the tempo that you want for this etude as prescribed by the Virginia Band and Orchestra Association. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add to my metronome. So I'm going to add 20 clicks to my metronome, but I'm only going to do a small unit. And in this case, I'm going to pick just the pickup notes and a beat, plus a quarter note beat, plus the next quarter note. So I'm going to do that a few times in a row. And it's going to be much faster than I actually will need. I went a little bit further on that one. So the next thing I would do, when I can do that consistently a couple of times in a row, 5, 10 times in a row, then I'm going to take 10 off my metronome, and I'm going to do what I would consider 2 units. A unit can be anything. It can be note to note, it could be beat to beat, it could be measure to measure, so that's another way you can use it on different layers. If you're trying to get a small unit faster, then you might want to go note to note. If you're trying to get the whole piece faster, you might take bigger chunks and do this to those based on the tempo that you can play it comfortably at. So here's 10 off that tempo, and I'm going to add 1 unit. And then again, I'll subtract another. And then another 10. And so on. If I do 4 or 5, maybe 6 beats or 6 units of it, that third one that I did was actually my original tempo, but it actually felt a lot slower to me because I'd done the other tempi. So then I try to just pick something that's a little bit above where I started and see if I can do it. So that's actually the tempo that we need right there, and I had started a little bit below that. So that's called, I call that a step down tempo method. So basically what I'm doing is I find where I can play a short passage perfectly. I'm going to find that tempo, and then I'm going to add 20, but I'm only going to play 1 unit. So I decide what a unit is. It could be a measure, it could be 2 beats, it could be 3 beats, it could be 1 beat, it could be note to note. You can decide based on what you're trying to learn. And then I'll play that 1 beat, that 1 unit, plus the start of the next unit just as a landing spot, and then I'll subtract 10, and then I'll do 2 units plus a landing spot, and then I'll subtract 10 and do 3 units plus a landing spot, and so on. I find that really helps me to build tempo in passages where I might stumble as I go through it, because now as I'm practicing through a passage like that, I'm actually slowing the tempo down as I get further into the passage. Another way to do that is actually to do it from the end of a passage and work your way backwards. Another app that I really like to use is an app called Drum Beats, and you could use that instead of a metronome. There's a pro version, which does cost a little fee, but it's really fun. It has a lot more beats in it, but there is a free version, and the tempo is just they don't give you specific numbers. So in some ways, practicing with that and a different kind of funky beat is actually really good, because you're not chasing a number on the metronome, and you're just trying to have good ensemble with the drum set player that is coming through the app. So I find that to be really fun. So these are just a few little practicing ideas and some fingering ideas that you might want to use as you're working on this all-state etude. And good luck, everybody.